Welcome back to Beyond the Boundaries, the radio program with the most informative content and controversial debates. My name is Emily Bard, and today we have a very sensitive topic, one that deals a lot with equal rights and specifically the racism and oppression the colored people of South Africa were put through for over 40 years, a system which wasn't abolished until only 26 years ago, the Apartheid. Before we can move on to the interview and the debate, we need to understand what exactly the Apartheid was, how it came to be, and how it was finally put to an end. During the Second World War, South Africa experienced a significant increase in immigration from the neighboring countries. As the upcoming election of 1948 ebbed closer, the National Party was presented with a new policy, which they called the Apartheid, meaning apartness. Severe segregation and racism had of course plagued South Africa before the National Party's new reform. However, as of 1948, when the National Party won the election and the apartheid policy was issued, this escalated. The apartheid classified people into four groups based on how they looked: black, white, Asian or Indian, and colored. These labels were stamped into passports and legal papers of every citizen of South Africa, and they came with a long list of prohibiting and oppressing laws. All non-whites were denied their right to vote and were forced from their homes to instead live in townships with poor living conditions. They were also denied the same education and occupations as the white population. After 42 years of segregation, oppression, and the deaths of thousands of innocent South African citizens, the apartheid regime was finally annulled in 1991. And in many people's eyes, we have an amazing man who has become a father figure for today's South Africa to thank for that, Mr. Nelson Mandela. Mandela was a lawyer and the president of the ANC, the African National Congress, a party fighting for majority vote and ending the apartheid regime. By the 60s, Mandela had become quite a famous anti-apartheid activist, inspired by the ways of Gandhi, with a large and growing following, and therefore became a threat in the eyes of the National Party. Thus, he was imprisoned in 1962 on charges of inciting workers' strikes and leaving the country without permission. During his 27 years of imprisonment, Mandela continued to be viewed as a role model for his fellow activists, fighting against the National Party's regime from within the walls of 3 different prisons to achieve a united South Africa without segregation. Many other countries all over the world supported the ANC with funds and protests against the apartheid and for Mandela's release. Finally, in early 1990, Mandela was released from prison. 4 years later, the ANC would win the election and Mandela became the president of South Africa. During his leadership, the new government instated free education for all, voting rights for all, and millions of new homes. Even after his passing, Mandela is still a role model and inspiration and a father figure for all people of South Africa. Now we have come to the next segment of our program, the interview. With me now I have Minenle Basson. Welcome, Mrs. Basson.
Thank you very much, Emily.
So, you lived in Johannesburg when the National Party rose to power and established the apartheid policy. Can you tell us about that time in your life in South Africa?
I was only 5 years old when the authorities came to my home in Johannesburg and forced us to leave. My family lived in a beautiful big home which had been in our family for decades, and we were forced away to live in these dirty small sheds in the black townships. I still remember asking my mother, oh mama, what is happening?" And all she could do was cry and hold me as we tried to pack everything we could carry to take with us to what would become our new home. After that, everything changed. I had white and color friends who I couldn't meet anymore because I now had the words black stamped on my legal documents. My parents lost their job and my brother was expelled from school. I never even got a chance to receive a basic education. Fortunately, my older brother sat with me every evening and taught me everything he knew, determined not to let the apartheid trump my potential. As a black person in South Africa, I was completely separated from the other groups. When I was shopping, I could only shop in black stores, and if I had to use a bus or public restroom, I could only use the ones labeled black or colored.
You no longer live in Johannesburg where you grew up. Why is that?
I fled. When I was 15 years old, my brother was killed by the police after being involved in a protest. Our house was raided by the police in search of any connection to the apartheid resistance, and they found it. My father had been communicating with imprisoned ANC members for years, and he had secret letters hidden in the tin roof of our small house. He and my mother were arrested immediately, but I wasn't home when the police came, so I was warned by my neighbors. I packed everything my neighbors could scrape together for me and left that same day to my uncle. He took me to the coast and smuggled me all the way to Australia, and I have lived there ever since. I got a proper education and I married a fine husband, and we have 3 children and lots of grandchildren now.
That's beautiful. Now, February 11th, 1990. Where were you, what were you doing, and what was your reaction upon hearing of Nelson Mandela's release?
Oh, I remember it as if it were yesterday. It was a Sunday, and my husband and I were watching Nelson Mandela on the television, watching him walk into freedom with his fist in the air and ANC flags surrounding him. And I remember immediately starting to weep. For me, the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela had always represented the imprisonment of my people, and with him being released was the people of South Africa being released from the apartheid.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us, Mrs. Bassam.
Thank you for having me.
Dear listeners, we have now come to the final segment of today's program, the debate, and today's issue can be the most controversial one yet. Today's issue reads, "The National Party was right to enforce the apartheid." I will be arguing against the issue, and today's guest listener will be arguing for. Now, he has asked to remain anonymous, but has informed me that I can refer to him by his pseudonym, Mr. Blake. Is that right, Mr. Blake?
Yes, that's correct.
As usual, we will both have 3 30-second opportunities each to present our 3 arguments and counter each other's. Mr. Blake, as you are arguing for this issue, you will start.
My first argument is that we have to put ourselves in the situation of the National Party leaders. This was a time of spark and crime rates due to the immigration of the blacks from the neighboring countries. As leaders of a country, you do what you must to protect your citizens, and they did. With the separation of the races, the hard-working citizens of South Africa could live their life without fear of any poor immigrant robbing them on the street. It kept everything under control.
I'm sure you are aware that your statement about hardworking people of South Africa applies to people of all ethnic backgrounds and not just whites, therefore rendering your first argument quite irrelevant as it contradicts itself. Furthermore, I would like to argue that as leader of a country, it is your duty to strive for the well-being of all of your citizens, not just the ones who have the same skin color as you do. What the National Party did was nothing more than an extremely racist and tyrannical way to feed their unsatisfiable hunger for power.
Most black people in South Africa were uneducated, poor, and criminal, hardly hard-working citizens. And if the National Party was so terrible for instating the apartheid, why were they able to in the first place, huh? They won the election. The people of South Africa voted for them to be their leading party, knowing about the new policy. This is the way of a democracy. The National Party won fair and square. Maybe not every person agreed with them, but the majority obviously did.
Mr. Blake, if you had done any kind of research about South Africa before and during the apartheid era, you would know that black people and most colored people weren't given the right to vote in the general election of 1948, thus making the majority of the voters white. Of course they would vote for the National Party, who promised to bring them better times. They were manipulated the same way Hitler and his party manipulated people of Germany. The election wasn't a democratic one, considering not all citizens of this so-called democracy were able to vote.
Well, finally, I would like to argue that the separation of the races greatly benefited the preservation of the South African culture. By keeping the people separated by race and prohibiting people from marrying other races and mixing all over the place, it prevented the traditions and heritage of the different cultures to mix. It is important that we, especially in today's day and age where the youth no longer respects and preserves their culture, preserve our ancestry the way it is. And that is all I have to say.
I'm all for preserving culture, but not through separating human beings into categories based on the color of their skin or the origin of their ancestors. Culture should be preserved through informing people about it and sharing it, not keeping it in a little glass jar only for yourselves. In a world where we have come so far in the terms of technology and knowledge, it is still shocking to note that racism still plagues every corner of the earth. What the youth has to do is not keep away from people who look different from them, but embrace the diversity of our society. Well, folks, that was the end of the debate and the end of today's program. To vote for which side you think won today's debate and for more information about the apartheid, log on to www.beyondtheboundariesradio.com, and I will see you next week. Goodbye.